Welcome back to another episode of the Market Maker podcast. Today, I want to talk to you guys about, if you remember the first episode, I talked a lot about different patterns that you can see in the market. I remember I talked about technical patterns, narrative patterns, macro patterns, stuff like that. Today, I want to talk to you about thematic patterns that I've noticed in the market. Kind of like perpetually hot themes that I've seen. It's something that I've noticed about the biggest winning stocks in history, pretty much, or at least the biggest market leaders. So stocks like the big one for me, obviously General Motors, since I'm still going through my study of the 1920s. That's the big one. And then you also have like IBM in the 50s and 60s, and then Microsoft in the 90s, and then of course something like an Nvidia today. So I'm talking about those kind of level of leaders in the market. There's something that I've noticed about these stocks and about the groups that they're in. And the framework that I have used, or I've basically incorporated this into, I call super sectors. So I refer to these different themes in the market as super sectors. So what is a super sector? So the way that I think about it or define it is I think about a super sector as the stocks or the theme in the market that has the technology behind it that essentially helps businesses reach dramatically more customers, work faster while cutting costs, basically. So they drastically increase the scale, scope, and speed of commerce through the economy while also reducing the costs. And when I talk about reducing costs and making drastic improvements and efficiencies and whatnot, I'm not talking about like 20, 30, 40, or even 50% increases. I'm talking about like 10x, 100x, or over 1,000x gains in efficiency, scale, scope, reach, cost cutting, etc. So these are basically like economic amplifiers that transform not just the industry that the technology is working in, but they transform the entire economy. Basically, every single corner of the economy is affected by these technologies, by this sector, this group. They basically create a virtuous cycle in which it creates more competition, leads to more innovation, and so on. And this all leads to greater efficiency within the economy. So to illustrate this point that I'm trying to talk about, let's go ahead and walk through an example together. So if you can imagine it's the 1860s and you are the owner of the only general store in this tiny little frontier town. Okay, the population is only 100 people. Very small town, out in the middle of nowhere, very difficult to get to. You have to remember, back in this time, the way that people would travel mostly be like on a horse, right? Either you're walking or you're riding on the back of a horse, or the horse is carrying you on a wagon or something. Okay, so maybe in this town you have, like I said, 100 people. Very tiny town, no reason for anyone to go there. You are the owner of the only general store in town. But then something comes by that changes everything. One of the railroads announces that they are going to be building tracks right by your town. Okay, so suddenly land speculators arrive. Construction crews come, new buildings pop up, and within a few years of the completion of this railroad through your town, the population has exploded. And now this town has been transformed into a thriving city of, let's say, 10 or even 20,000 people. Okay, and that wouldn't be something that would be completely unheard of back in the day. Your potential customer base has just increased by 10 or 20,000%. Okay, so this is the kind of level that we're talking about with these super sectors. Massive increases in reach for a business like this. And not only does this bring many more people to your town, but it also allows for you to ship some of your goods. Maybe you have goods that are hard to come by in other parts of the country. You can now ship those goods in a cost-effective manner to other parts of the country, and vice versa. You can also import specialty products from other parts of the country. And these trains also don't carry just incrementally more cargo than you could have with a horse and wagon, but they haul hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of times more cargo in a much, much shorter amount of time than you would have been able to do with a horse and a wagon. So for example, one train car could haul about 100 tons versus roughly 1 ton that a wagon could haul. And then what would take a covered wagon 6 months could be done in a single week by train. So these are the kind of things that I'm talking about. These giant improvements in the ability to conduct commerce throughout the economy, essentially. It removes friction in getting commerce done and lowers cost. Now, if we relate this back to normal hot sectors, where I think we're all familiar with what a hot sector is, hot group or hot theme in the market. So like in 2020, obviously the work from home stocks, the stay at home stocks, stuff like, or the COVID stocks, for example. So like mRNA, BioNTech, Pfizer, Zoom, stuff like that. That was super hot. These super sectors obviously do become hot sectors at certain points in time. But one of the biggest differences is, well, let's take solar stocks, for example. Okay, so solar stocks have been hot at various different times over the last couple decades or so. But solar energy, while it can be very important and very helpful, is basically just variation on a theme, if you will, right? It's like solar energy would be to the energy sector what, Rocky Road is to an ice cream shop. It's a new flavor of the same thing, right? It doesn't fundamentally change the entire industry or the economy at large, right? You think about weed stocks back when they were hot, like 2016, 17, 18. If weed is legalized in the US or Canada, obviously that would be great for Tilray's bottom line. Okay. But it's not going to have wider spread effects throughout the economy where it's going to help businesses compete with one another. Maybe it'll sell more rolling papers. It'll help Jack in the Box sell more Munchie Meals, but it's not going to help people reach more customers more efficiently and at lower costs. And one of the big characteristics of these super sectors is their massive ability to transform business models, to create new business models, essentially seemingly overnight. So one example would be going back to the railroads. So in 1869, the first continental railroad was completed in the US. And that same year, you had a business startup called Montgomery Ward. Now, some of you are probably familiar with Montgomery Ward and Sears. They were both what we would refer to as retail mail order businesses. Okay, so the idea is it's almost exactly one for one what Amazon is today, just the 19th century version of Amazon. Okay, so the way that the business model worked would be Montgomery Ward would have a catalog of different items available for purchase, hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of items eventually they would have in their catalog. They would go ahead and mail for free. They'd go ahead and mail this catalog out to as many people as they could. And the way that it would work would be these people would look through the catalog. They would see some products that they like. Then they would take the order page or whatever out of the catalog. They would mark up the things that they wanted to purchase. They would put their money in an envelope along with their order, and they would go ahead and mail it off to the company. And after several weeks or months or however long it took, their product would arrive at their door or at their post office. So it was basically like Amazon, like I said, 200 years ago. And something like that would absolutely be completely impossible before the completion of something like the Transcontinental Railroad. Exactly the same way that Amazon would be impossible before the invention or the widespread use of the internet. Okay, so these are the kinds of changes that you see with the introduction of these new super sectors, or at least the technologies behind them. And one crucial point I want to drive home also is a lot of the biggest benefits that they have is that they help other companies. Okay. They create more customers and services that can be offered by other companies. Okay. So, like we said before, solar energy is great for solar companies or, for energy industries, people who sell electricity, but it's not going to be game changing for somebody who sells beef in Omaha or who sells electronic components in San Diego or something, right? So that is a very important factor to keep in mind, is that these super sectors massively help other businesses, other industries benefit greatly from these technologies. So since I've been doing my study, I've come to recognize a handful, maybe about 6 of these major super sectors. Okay, and what I've noticed is that they typically will dominate the market in terms of when these stocks are healthy, the overall market is healthy, and when these stocks are depressed, the overall market likewise is also depressed. So since about the 1840s or so to, the early 20th century, we have the railroads. Okay, so that is the first super sector. The second one would be the automobile group, which came to prominence in 1915 during the World War I market. The third would be the electronics and computing group. So this came about in the 1950s and grew quite a bit in the 1960s. Fourth would be the internet. So the previous group, the electronics and computing group, kind of morphed into this or branched off into the internet group in the 1990s. And then right now we have AI. So the fifth group would be AI. And then the sixth group, I believe, is crypto. So another thing that I have noticed with the development of these super sectors is it seems that they kind of play out in 3 distinct phases. So the first phase that I have noticed, I call the nascent growth phase. Okay, phase 1 is nascent growth. So in this phase, the technology is pretty new and very speculative. So the stocks related to this group are quite volatile. Okay, they're not yet market leaders or anything like that. They have big moves up and down, like dramatic moves. They can go up, 2, 3, 4, 500% in a year. And the next year they could be down like 80, 90%. Okay. So at this stage, most people are still pretty skeptical, but traders and investors in the know can recognize the potential of the group and they start to play them pretty heavily. So this nascent growth phase is typically the first bull market to feature this super sector as a main focus of speculative activity. So the second phase, I call the establishment phase. Okay, so in this phase, this is the start of wider adoption. So the sector begins to prove itself as a real economic force. And those who were previously skeptical find it increasingly more difficult to remain so. Okay, so more people who were previously skeptical become converts. And then the third phase, I call the stalwart phase. Okay, so this is the phase where mass adoption really begins. Okay, so this sector becomes like a new cornerstone of the economy. The leaders of the group are now blue chip stocks. They're much less volatile, but they've become increasingly more important. Okay, and it's also pretty critical to understand which phase you're in, of both for traders and investors alike. You don't want to be treating one of these things as a great long-term investment when it's at the nascent growth phase at phase 1. because the odds of any of these companies in this group basically imploding even after a 2,000% gain in a few years is very, very high. Okay, so again, they haven't proven themselves really until at least the second stage. That's when I think it becomes more feasible to try to look for more longer term investment in these things. But you have to keep in mind that, at each phase, it's going to be, nothing's guaranteed. So this is not investment advice, obviously. Just the framework that you can use to help you make your own decisions in the market. But for right now, I want to go back to the example of General Motors. So, like I said before, when GM went public in 1911 as the first publicly traded car company, it was fairly thinly traded, and it basically just went sideways in a little range for the first several years of its life on the market. But then World War I came and completely changed everything. Suddenly, everyone needed trucks and cars for the war effort. Over in Europe, especially, they were ordering massive amounts of these cars. But then, after the war ended, there was high levels of inflation. There was a recession that lasted a couple of years. And then, of course, in the mid and later 1920s, you had the, bubble, the stock market bubble. And this is the time when GM and the rest of the group basically had their establishment phase. Okay, so if World War I was their nascent growth phase, their phase one, as they were, definitely the heavy favorites for speculative activity during World War I. In the market of the later 1920s, they became, General Motors became the largest corporation in the world in the later 20s, like 27 or 28 or something like that. Became the largest company in the world. And just less than it was founded in 1909, I think. So in less than 20 years, it went from nothing to literally the largest company in the world. So that's the kind of power that we're talking about here with these super sector technologies. And then, of course, after the crash, there were some hard times for a while, but the motor group, the automobile industry, remained a very important part of the economy. It only grew really in importance through the 40s, 50s, and 60s or so. So at this time, in the 1920s, everyone was looking to GM to see the health of the market. If GM was strong, odds of the market being strong were pretty high. And this is something that also happened, in subsequent decades, as the motor group was the, center of the economic force of the market in the broader economy. The leaders in the group, Chrysler and General Motors, and then of course, Ford came public in 1956. These were considered, the barometers of health in the market. Just like IBM would become later, just like NVIDIA is today. So a short little summarization or recap of the General Motors timeline would be, came public in 1909, and then 1915 is when it hit, along with the other stocks in the group, that's when they hit the phase one, the nascent growth phase. And then in the 1920s, 1925 or so, 1926, is when they hit their establishment phase, when they really became a dominant force and more established in the broader economy and market. And then, it wasn't until later that they became, more mature, maybe the 1930s or 40s or so, where the industry became much more mature and the overall bellwether for the strength and health of the market. So what does all of this really mean as it relates to your personal trading or investing? So first, super sector leaders are historically some of the best stocks to trade during bull markets. And obviously, they become some of the best investments of all time. Keeping in mind that most of these stocks, especially if they go through some kind of like bubble market or euphoric market, odds of them crashing 50, 60, 70% or more are pretty high. Even the leaders are going to be crashing at least 50%. off their highs. But you want to be looking for the liquid leaders in these emerging super sectors, especially when they're breaking out of multi, like, I don't know, like 6-month bases or multi-year bases. I've seen examples, really good examples of this on stocks like Microsoft, for example, in like 1989, 1990 or so, and then obviously later through the 90s. But we also saw it with NVIDIA in 2024. You could see it on IBM, General Motors. But this brings me to another point, which is don't ignore the suppliers. Okay, what do I mean by the suppliers? So the perfect example is NVIDIA today. Okay, it's pretty hard to say that NVIDIA is a purely AI company, right? There are not really many of those in the market right now. And what I mean by that is they don't actually create AI themselves, right? They're the supplier to the broader AI industry. They're the picks and shovels play. In order for the industry to grow and thrive and just to operate, they need NVIDIA and what they produce, right? So another example of this is U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel was created in 1901, and basically ever since its creation, it was, the biggest steel company, even the biggest company in the U.S. that supplied, the raw materials for industrialization, which led to it being, obviously one of the largest companies, if not the largest company at many different times. And maybe you can even think of something like Dell Computer in the 1990s, which went up like, 100x or something like that from 1990 to 2000. You could think of that kind of as a picks and shovel play as well, because in order to use the internet, in the 90s, you had the internet boom. In order to use the internet, you needed to have a computer, right? So in a sense, Dell was basically providing the infrastructure or the raw materials needed to take advantage of that new super sector, the internet, right? And by extension, or likewise, you could think of Microsoft, which also became the largest company in the world in the 90s by providing software and other various applications for computers. They didn't provide computers themselves. They weren't directly an internet company in the 90s, although they provided products and services that helped proliferate or help the ease of use of the internet. Okay. So if you think about NVIDIA's example, I would think of something like an OpenAI or an Anthropic as being a true AI company, whereas NVIDIA, in my mind, is more of like a supplier to the industry rather than an AI company itself. Although it's heavily connected to the AI industry. And the third thing I want to recap on is that timing really matters. So the first bull market to feature this new super sector is typically when massive investments are going to pour in, right? But it's also when these things are the most speculative. Okay, so the number of stocks to choose from will be greatest, or it'll be typically much greater at this time than in the later phases. But the future is also much more uncertain. In let's say 1919 or something, 1915, General Motors looked like it would be the successor to Ford, that it would be a Ford killer. It would be able to dominate the market apart from Ford. And then you get into the recession after the First World War, and General Motors was ass. Okay. It heavily underperformed even some of the other automobile stocks. And you probably would have written it off by, 1921 or so. It had a pretty horrific time in the post-war period. While on the other hand, another auto stock that saw a great deal of speculation and investment at the time was Studebaker. Obviously, Studebaker does not exist anymore. But in the post-war recovery, in the midst of this recession, 1920 to 21 or so, right after this in 1920, I think it was like the bottom in like 1921 to, 1922 or so, Studebaker was actually about 10 times more liquid than General Motors, about 1922 or so. And also, while Studebaker proceeded to make a 270% gain, General Motors fell about 50%. And this is after it had already come off of another 50% decline. Okay, so General Motors was a weak, massively underperforming stock at this time. And if you were making bets, you were trying to invest in the future of the automobile industry, odds are you would have been buying Studebaker. It was one of, if not the most liquid stock in the market, and sometimes was twice as liquid as U.S. Steel, which is, always one of the most liquid stocks in the market. But if you would have held on to your Studebaker investment, in 1924 to 1929 bull market, Studebaker rose from $40 to $95 in 1928, 1929, while GM at the same time would have gone from a split adjusted $5 to $90. Okay, so you're talking about if you held on to Studebaker, which was outperforming and looked like the better investment in 1921, 1922, you would have been holding a 140% gain, which isn't bad, it's not life-changing, but that compared to a 1,700% gain, that can be life-changing. So it's important to keep tabs on the progression of the super sectors, right? And the individual stocks and leaders in the group. So you're not making a mistake like this, okay, which is inevitably going to happen. If you look back at the 1990s, the stocks that looked best were, Microsoft was the largest company in the world. Very strong, great fundamentals. But in the crash, from 2003 to 2014, if you were to have bought Cisco and Microsoft both in January of 2003, coming out of the dot-com crash, you're ready to make an investment for the long term. So you invest in January 2003 in both of these stocks. By January of 2014, your Cisco stock would have actually gained more value than your Microsoft investment, believe it or not. But of course, from 2014 till today, Microsoft has gone up over 1,300%, while Cisco has, increased like 200%. You don't want to be putting your money into something based on a hunch, based on what you feel might happen. You need to do some more deeper digging other than just looking at these super sector stocks, seeing what was a leader in one era, one phase, one of these growth phases, and then thinking that, oh, well, it was the liquid leader in this growth phase. I'm going to bet on it for, the future. It's not going to necessarily work out that well, or it's very likely that, in the wake of a big crash, your money's going to be dead money for, up to a decade, like Microsoft, in the 1929 crash. A lot of those stocks never really recovered. A lot of them never recovered their 1929 highs. Stocks like RCA, they were still great businesses. They were still leaders in what they did. But the stocks, on the other hand, were less favorable. Okay, so just something to keep in mind if you're trying to use this as a framework to invest in. Trading is a little bit different because it has more of that time element, the timing element involved, whereas investing is kind of more like a set it and forget it, which can be kind of dangerous if you're doing it this way. Either you get into something that's dead money for 10, 20 years, or, even worse, you buy into something that just continues to go down. So those are just some things that I think you should keep in mind when you're, if you decide that this is something that might have some value to you in markets going forward, in thinking about the transformative power of AI and crypto that we're currently seeing at the moment. Yeah, but to summarize the idea, the bottom line is that super sectors create massive opportunities through the transformational power that they have for other companies, right? It's not just what they do for their own industry or their own sector. The way that solar energy helps the energy industry or the energy sector, yeah, it's not going to have revolutionary, life-changing implications for a retail store halfway across the world, the way that the internet can have, literally life-changing consequences for small stores in the middle of nowhere, basically. So thank you guys for listening. If you think this helped changed your perspective on how you see the market and you see these developing hot themes that keep popping up every so often throughout the market, please go ahead and share it with someone who you think might be interested in it as well. And again, thanks for listening, and see you guys next time.